I'm with Dov Lipman, and we're here talking about his book, An American MK. Dov, what is the book about?
So I was blessed to serve as a member of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, and I was the first American-born member of Knesset in 30 years. And when I finished my time in the Knesset, I realized that on two fronts. One was for me, just to have a period of reflection and writing down my memories just for me to have. But so many people said, we want to know what it's like. What is it like in the Knesset? What happens behind the scenes? How do things work in the Israeli government? Tell us some of your stories that happened while you served. And that really formed the basis of the book, which the subtitle is Behind the Scenes of the 19th Knesset. And it's broken up into a few different parts. Part of it is my story, how I got to the Knesset. Part of it is about what my responsibilities were in the Knesset. Part of it is just some of the great stories that took place as a member of Knesset. And then also just an understanding of how the system in Israel works.
You must have met some interesting people while in the Knesset.
Really, I think back on the stories, and I could tell stories for hours, but some of the connections that were made, one is Mariano Rivera, who is one of the all-time great baseball players in America, who is one of the greatest supporters of Israel out there. He's now a spokesman for Christians United for Israel, and just an amazing person. I was blessed to meet the now President of the United States, Joe Biden. He was vice president then, speaking at the Knesset. I spent a few minutes speaking with him. World leaders, entertainers, athletes, things along those lines. And almost every single interaction had a fascinating story behind it. And that was certainly one of the enjoyable parts about being in politics.
When you're a member of the Knesset, is there a sense that you're making history?
There are times that you do have that feeling, and there are times that you don't. I want to explain. A lot of the hours are you're sitting in committees that are dealing with, one line of one rule of one finance ministry edict, and you say to yourself, what am I doing? I'm really sitting here for 3 hours debating this point. But then there are moments that are historic in nature. There are laws that are passed that are historic. There are events that take place that are historic. And those are the moments where you really do feel, wow, I'm really a part of something. And when I got elected, someone told me, I forgot the exact number, I was number 861 or something like that of members of Knesset in history. That sounded such a low number to me. And that really magnified for me the blessing that God gave me to be able to be in this role.
How was your first day going as a member of the Knesset into Parliament?
Emotional. That's the first word I'll use. I stopped along the way. My father passed away 17 years ago and is buried here in Israel. So I stopped along the way at his grave just to thank him, but also to go to the Knesset with him. My father was so much a part of who I am. That certainly set me on an emotional day. Standing in the Knesset chamber and standing up and saying, I obligate myself, is a very powerful moment and one that I'll never forget. There's a lot of unknowns, a lot of question marks, a lot of confusion. Literally just finding your way around the building is a process. It takes a few months to really get a handle on the schedule, on what's going on around you, on how to develop your own agenda to get things done. But also exhilarating. Every single day as the car turned the corner and I saw this building in front of me, I really looked up and said, thank you, God, for this opportunity. Because, we're so many of us read the newspapers, we watch the news, and we just complain about what's happening in our countries. And now I was able to go to work every day and try to fix things. And that was a real blessing.
You've had family that were in the Holocaust. So was it a time of reflecting to say, look how far we've came as a nation here in Israel?
Well, let me say it to you this way. My grandmother, who has since passed away, was a Holocaust survivor, and she came and visited me in the Knesset somewhere around 70 years after her liberation from Auschwitz-Birkenau. So this is a woman who arrived in May 1944, and that night, her parents, siblings, 30 nieces and nephews were murdered in the gas chambers that night. And she was young and she was spared, and she somehow miraculously, with God's help, survived. And 70 years later, she's sitting in the Knesset, and she's the one who said to me, Dov, this doesn't make any sense. A Jewish state, Israel, Jewish capital, Jerusalem, Jewish parliament, the Knesset, my grandson as a member, this doesn't make, and she's right. We're blessed to live in times where things don't make sense in the most positive of terms as God is pulling the strings and making things happen. And there's no doubt that I took that with me. We traveled back to Poland with a Knesset delegation to mark 70 years after liberation. And there I was, marching along the platform of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the train platform, surrounded by soldiers. 70 years beforehand, my grandmother is taken off a cattle car, surrounded by soldiers barking orders and sending her parents to be murdered. And I'm surrounded by Israeli Knesset honor guard carrying the Israeli flag, marching in that same place as a member of Knesset. If you don't get inspiration from that, you're not living. And I will never forget that moment. And I certainly carried the mantle of grandchild of Holocaust survivor through that experience very proudly.
She must have been very proud to come to the Knesset when her grandson is there after everything that she's been through.
I'll send you a picture of her with me in my Knesset office, and she just had this smile on her face the entire time. It was just this calm and this peace and almost this, I can't believe this is happening type of look on her face throughout the experience.
Now, you were the first American-born MK in the Knesset in over 30 years. Did people look to you because you were American, because you're an English speaker?
They really did, and I was very surprised by this, but we got thousands of messages of people asking for help for small things and larger things. You have to remember, most of the English speakers who moved to Israel come from countries where you have your MP, you have your member of parliament who is from your region, and they're responsible to take care of you, and they have to go up for election every few years. And in Israel, we don't have that. It's just national elections where no one's responsible for any specific place. So we're used to a system where I can turn to my member of Congress and get help, and now all of a sudden that wasn't happening. So they found an English speaker in the Knesset. They said maybe he can help us. And we really did try to turn our office into a hub of activity to help these people. And when I reflect back on my time in Knesset, that was definitely one of the more meaningful aspects of the job, to know that I'm helping fellow immigrants to Israel to navigate life in Israel.
Are you wanting to be a member of the Knesset again sometime in the future?
I don't have a burning desire for it. If I can continue doing what I'm doing right now, I run an organization called Yad Le'olim, where I help new immigrants through a lot of Israeli bureaucracy and being their voice, actually, in the Knesset. If I could do that without being in the craziness of politics and elections, and I'd rather do that. I'm more effective that way. I don't like the wheeling and dealing of politics, and I would be thrilled to be able to do this the rest of my life without having to go back to the Knesset. If the right opportunity ever presented itself where I felt like I could really make a bigger difference that way, I would explore it.
What interesting or funny stories have you had being in the Knesset?
There's so many. One which I'll share, I think it was a Monday morning, and I was in the finance committee. So every single Monday morning, they give you get hundreds of pages of documents from the finance ministry to check over the money the government's going to spend. And one Monday, there was this debate about hundreds of millions of shekel they wanted to transfer from one education system to another, and I was yelling and screaming. There was yelling and screaming in the room, and then the attorney of the committee asked for a 10-minute recess. So here I am, I'm a former American. I went on my iPad on NFL.com to watch the football highlights from the previous day. Just those 10 minutes to clear my head a little bit. And I saw a play I've never seen before. If anybody wants to look it up, it was a catch made by a wide receiver named Odell Beckham Jr. And just to myself, I said, wow. As I saw him make a really talented play in sport. And the member of Knesset next to me said, what happened? I said, oh, nothing, it's silly, it's just sports. He said, show me. And I showed it to him, and he says, voila, wow. And he calls over the next. Before I knew it, I had every member of Knesset from the Knesset Finance Committee gathered around my seat watching this sports play over and over again, and they're all excited, and they're slapping five with one another. The attorney came back in, and everyone was best of friends, and they passed the 700 million shekel without any question. I think to myself, what just happened here? Somehow this football player in America helped bring together all these sides. And that's just one of the stories that definitely sticks out in my mind as just a crazy, wacky story that took place here.
Wow. Have you written any other books as well?
I've been blessed to write 8 other books. I started with a book on Jewish philosophy for teenagers called Discover. Then I wrote a book on spiritual lessons that you can learn from sports stories. It's called Time Out. I wrote a book for the Passover Seder to help families have a meaningful Seder experience on Passover night called Seder Savvy. I wrote a book called To Unify a Nation, which is like my vision for the future of Israel. I co-authored an amazing book, which is called Words Can Kill, related to the Rabin assassination, and actually a true story behind the scenes that many people don't know about an agent of Israeli security agent who decided to kill the assassin and then chose last minute not to. It's a true story, and that's out there. I wrote this American MK. I wrote a book called New Beginnings, which is lessons that we learn from the weekly Torah portion that we read on Sabbath day. and working on a few other projects now as well. And then I also have a book called Fact Over Fiction, which is a challenge to Barack Obama's history of Israel. So those are the books that I've been blessed to write, and certainly, they all have different meanings to me, but An American MK is really the only autobiographical one.
What's your prayer for the future of Israel?
My prayer is that Israel should continue to be a light unto the nations, and I say continue because it already is. I believe the state of Israel is impacting the world in the most beautiful of ways, and that it continue to do so by through its technology, through its medical advances, through showing the world an incredible story of a broken people who came back with a trust in God that this would happen. My prayer for Israel is that it should be a place where every single Jew around the world can come and make it their home. And finally, that be a place where every single person of faith around the world can come and connect and feel the closest to God that you can only get in the Holy Land.
How can people get a hold of your book, An American MK?
So if you just go on Google and you do An American MK, it's Trafford Press is the publisher. I believe it's probably available through Amazon as well. And they're certainly welcome to tap into it. There's probably a digital and a regular softcover version of it. And people have said that it really helped them understand. When they see the news about Israeli politics now, they understand much more because of it. And hopefully more than anything else, it'll show people that anything can happen. That a person can grow up in Silver Spring, Maryland, with no thoughts in his mind of moving to Israel, and not only move to Israel with his family, but end up serving as a member of the Israeli parliament.
Okay, Rabbi Dov Lipman, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.